morning. I'm Kerry, Haynie. I teach in political science and African American studies here at Duke. And again, I want to welcome you to the last panel of this conference, Social Movements, Democracy, and the Politics of Difference. Let me first congratulate my colleagues for organizing what has been, I understand, a very lively and engaging conference. So all of these sponsors and co-sponsors and organizers ought to be congratulated. Let me also say that this program exemplifies the kind of work that we see coming from the Center for African and African American Research. Truly global collaborations, interdisciplinary kinds of programs at the forefront of what we try to do here at Duke. So I congratulate Randy and the Center for leading this effort. We also, sorry I couldn't be with you for the previous days of the conference. I just got off a plane from Germany, where these issues are beginning to percolate in places like Germany and in other places in Europe. We'll proceed as follows. Professor Augusto dos Santos from Brazil will lead us off, and you see the title of his presentation. And we also have on the panel Professor Kamala Westward from the University of Texas at Austin. And the title of her talk is Democracy as the Sign of Corruption. She'll follow Augusto. And then Arturo Escobar from my neighbor, a few miles down the road, UNC Chapel Hill, will talk about the scope and limits of state action, some lessons from Afro-Colombian social movements. Without further ado.
Good morning for everyone. First, I would like to thank the Duke Center of African and African American Research and the University of Malaysia. So thanks Professor Haynie and Professor Terry Gomes. And I would like to thank to Professor John French for everything. Thank you. And I would like to thank you, Bernice and Kayla too. It was important for us here. So let's go. But I will need Laura's help to show the PowerPoint because my English is not fluent. I will read and the test is the article. So, between left and right, the descendants of slaves in Brazil remain blacks. The few affirmative action policies that have been or are being implemented in Brazil in the last 50 years are not a result of a goodwill of governments. So, I would like to emphasize that the current stage of inclusion of black population in higher education is not the fruit of policies that originated with a Brazilian state. I think that regardless of ideological alignment of Brazilian government, whether dealing with the administration of President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, oriented by a neoliberal political praxis, or that President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, based upon central-like visions, policies designated to confront racial-based inequalities have and still continue to occupy a minor places in Brazilian government efforts to achieve effective development for the country. Thus, for my perspective, policies of affirmative actions and promote racial equality are not yet being seen as integral to a state project that should set as a priority moving Brazil beyond racism. In addition, I think that institutional intentions regarding to promote of racial equality, whether to support or oppose, are independent of ideological coloration or part affiliation, although those inclined to the right remain more resistant to change in this area. The advent of such policies over the last decade in result of years of struggle against racism. It also read an antecedent in the realization of Zumbi dos Palmares' March Against Racism for Citizenship and Lives on the 20th of November 1995, the frontiers, in Brazil. This march broke the discussion of the racial question ever close to the frontiers of the state actions. With 30,000 people, the march was organized to reaffirm Afro-Brazilian struggles and to demand to enactment of public policies for the black population on an emergency basis. With powerful voice, those present at that march denounced racism and racial discrimination and pressured the government to take actions in a timely fashion. Beyond this, the law denunciations were converted into an action program present to the state entitled Program for Overcoming Racism and Racial Inequality. It contained various proposals, and for my purpose here, I will cite only one in the area of education, that is, development of affirmative action for the access of black to professionalized schools, to university and areas of cutting-edge technology. Thus, the Zumbi dos Palmares March served to give visibility to proposals designated for educational arena. So I will start about Fernando Henrique administration. Although President Cardoso received the demands of the march, no concrete steps were taken to include the black population in higher education. No project in favor of such a policy was present by Cardoso's administration to Brazilian Congress. No daring action appeared on the horizon of the possible. In fact, Cardoso led a neoliberal administration that was sustained by a majority governing coalition of the center-right that was opposed to affirmative action policies, especially those in higher education. Although Cardoso declared his long-standing conviction against racial injustice, he made a few advances in terms of actions that would promote racial equality, whether in higher education or other areas. Quite to contrary, his administration did not seek to put into place a policy of quotas for public universities in Brazil, even after the initiative was highlighted during the World Conference Against Racism, Homophobia, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, held in 2001. The vacillating tone of the president in 1998 interview by a journalist, Roberto Toledo, illustrates this clearly. I received the interview. The journalist, you also said that a system of quotas combat racial discrimination will not be acceptable in Brazil. Why? It could even be. We have to look at the circumstance. You have said that Brazilians don't like the quota system. Why? Couldn't it be used, for example, to facilitate educational access for blacks? There is a great reaction against the idea because it implies leaving to one side of the evaluation of merit. Thus, it will be discrimination. The opposition to quota is very strong. If we even within the Ministry of Education. But black movements are in favor. Yes, they are in favor. To extend to which will broaden education access, universalize it, the possibility for accent of black will be greater. It takes longer, but it produces results. I don't want to enter into a discussion of a quota system, given the resistance it provokes, but I am not against it. Having two people apt to nominate for given a post, with one then being black, I would choose the black. The official policy of Brazil is not to accept racism. If it were different, it will be easier to fight it. Because of this, since there isn't an official negative policy of racism to fight against, might perhaps a system of quotas be necessary, don't you think? As for the university, which is where basically a quota would be applied, the matter is complicated. Now, I think it's important to carry out a great effort focused on employment. In Brazil, state administration discrimination has fallen a great deal. The state in this regard is doing better than the market. Is better than the market. Look at Itamaraty. They are beginning to have black diplomats. And there are many blacks in the armed forces. In this regard, armed forces are truly democratic. The other question. Are the black generals? Perhaps not generals. There is, however, black colonel work in my office. He is not mulatto, pardo, or mixed. He is black, he is a colonel, and he works in my office. I hope he will become a general because I think it's important, because of need for affirmative action. Wow. The ambiguity of the president's response, based on attempts to evade the question, demonstrated his declination to implement affirmative action as public policy. Make use of contradictory arguments, the president tries to cover up his position while also state his reservation in terms of universities. At very least, FHC or Cardoso's support for affirmative action policy can be said not to extend to quotas. In truth, only 2 affirmative action policies were implemented in the federal administration and only in the last year of Cardoso's government. The first was created in Ministry of Foreign Relations in March 2002. It was the Fellowship Prize for Diplomacy that offered 20 fellowships by year worth 15,000 reals to pay for black candidates' preparations to take exams to enter into a diplomatic career. The second affirmative action program put in place under FHC was the Diversity in the University program that fell within the Ministry of Education. Through this program, a study fellowship were given to low-income and Afro-Brazilian who were enrolled in special colleges exam preparatory class, were known as the pré-vestibular courses for black and needy. Both programs were fragile, with no guarantees that Afro-Brazilians would have success, since it consisted on a scholarship for preparatory studies for university admission and civil service exams. Yet, most recognize that Cardoso was insufficient in undertaking effective measures. His government did contribute on the symbolic plane in terms of raising the possibilities of overcome racism. He was the first president that affirmed publicly that Brazil was a country that discriminates against its black population. This fact occurred in July 1996 at the International Meeting on Multiculturalism and Racism, the role of affirmative action in contemporary democratic states, jointly organized by the University of Brasilia and the Human Rights Department of the Ministry of Justice. This international meeting also was a response to the Zumbi dos Palmares March Against Racism and Citizenship and Life. It was the first time in the history of the country that the chief of the state officially recognized the existence of the racism and racial discrimination. In publicly admitting the existence of racial inequality due to the racism, Cardoso left an unprecedented social-political legacy. In addition to the government actions and changes in presidential schools, black movements can also be credited with changes in the country's normative structure, as in the case of the National Program of Human Rights, created in 1996. For the first time in the history of Brazil, the insertion of the theme of affirmative action appeared in official document. Much of what was included in it in this regard was practically a copy of the proposals elaborated by black movement in their program to overcome racism and racial inequality, including development, affirmative actions to provide access of black to professionalized courses, university, and areas of cutting-edge technology. Yet, overall, the Cardoso's government, despite some changes in discourse and anti-racist legislation, can be said to have done more in symbolic plane rather than in terms of concrete change, of moving from a position of a policy of not having policy to one have a policy, since proposals for the inclusion of black in positions of precious power and command to affirmative action is more formal than substantive. Now I speak about Lula administration. At the end, Cardoso's administration in 2001-2002, there were heated debates about the inclusion of black population in higher education in Brazil. In reality, these debates had been recurrent throughout the debates, throughout the decade, and the demand to increase the presence of Afro-Brazilians in the university had achieved some positive results. The discussion of need to implement affirmative action and higher education for the black population had grown during these years due to the action of black movement and the international conjuncture of renewed anti-racist struggle symbolized by the 2001 Durban Conference. The racial question has now been definitively included on the Brazilian national agenda. This emerging environment repositioned the racial question on the national agenda on an entirely different level, including its incorporation into programs of presidential candidates in 2002. Various candidates present proposals to fight racism and in favor of inclusion of black population in areas of precious power and command through affirmative action, including Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. After taking power, President Lula created the Special Secretariat on policies to promote equality, CAAAR, on 21 March 2003 in response to repeated appeals by black movements. In a speech at its inauguration, Lula ratified the recognition by Cardoso that there is racial discrimination against black in Brazil. However, one must not forget that many consider the creation of CAAAR as uncontestable evidence of its commitment, like research Marilene de Paula. Yet, those who defend the position that Lula government defends racial equality without hesitation ignore the fact that the government was inaugurated on January 1, 2003, with the creation of its various ministries and secretariats. The special secretariats that duty with women, with agriculture and fishery were created before CAAAR, funded only 2 months and 21 days after its inauguration. And the creation of CAAAR was due to strong pressure by black movements who sought a minister to deal with the racial question. This was a demand that was first advanced under Cardoso administration, but the Cardoso government resisted to creation of such an institution, and Lula's government, more sensitive to social movements, after resisting, gave in to the pressure and created CAAAR. However, CAAAR has not had the infrastructure to function with dignity, not have even today the number of civil service qualified functionaries needed to accomplish its work. In summary, it lacks the appropriate human resource, even today. On the other hand, for some resource, Lula's government marks a new phase of deepening of the racial question with the broadening of the state's action. For these authors, the educational arena is where affirmative action has progressed the furthest. According to Marilena de Paula, unlike FHC government, the policies on race under Lula have given great visibility and large-scale programs were implemented. A significant advance has occurred in higher education. To sustain this claim, this author goes on to see 2 affirmative action policies under the Lula administration. The first, the University for Everyone, ProUni, and the Law 10,639 from 2003 make the study of Afro-Brazilian and indigenous cultural and history mandatory in school. Yet, the actions taken are too fragile to sustain this test that deepening engagement with the racial question the Lula government has occurred tend towards to overcome of racism. First, Law 2,639 falls under valorized actions. It does not necessarily involve executing affirmative action policies. Second, there is no doubt that ProUni is an affirmative action program in higher education implemented through a system of quotas. Created on September 10, 2004 and operating through the Ministry of Education, ProUni offers both full-time and part-time scholarship for students who have complemented their high school education in public school. It established a sub-quota for those from public school that applies to self-declared blacks and indigenous students. According to ProUni, the percentage of the student scholarship destined to implement affirmative action policies in higher education should be at least equal to the percentage of self-declared indigenous, pardos or mixed, or blacks, pretos, in the respective unit of the federation, according to the most recent census. ProUni has been successful in terms of access in the inclusion of low-income student and private higher education sector, including self-declared blacks who in 2010 made 47% of the total of the scholarships holders. According to Madeleine de Paula, it's largely responsible for elevating the percentage of students in higher education. The importance of this process of include through ProUni for low-income black students cannot be denied, and the numbers are significant. From 2005-2010, 814 fellowships were distributed to black students. However, like diversity in the university program originated under Cardoso administration, the ProUni appears as one more attempt to lessen the constant and growing pressure for quotas for Afro-Brazilian students in public universities. There is another factor that indicates that ProUni is only a palliative rather than a conscious policy to facilitate the entry of black into positions of prestige, power, and command. The various opponents of quota for black students in public higher education, like social scientists Yvonne Magui and Peter Fry, did not oppose ProUni despite its quota future. And they didn't do so because they knew that private universities in Brazil are not of the same quality as the public ones. In this way, this inclusion of black students by ProUni served as an escape valve in terms of pressure to implement quotas in public university. So, even in a center-left government oriented by a vision that is more pro-social than pro-market, affirmative action for black students did not have the desired support, since only on a policy of affirmative action was implemented during this term of conclusion. When we compare the Cardoso and Lula administration, there seems that be no great difference in terms of proposed support, passage, and execution of affirmative action policies for black population. In terms of fight for racial equality, the analysis of these two governments can lead us, at first glance, to believe that conclusion of the black activist Sueli Carneiro. In 2000, she said, "You know, between left and right, I know that I continued black. That is, discriminated against and excluded for being black." In terms of executive affirmative action, it may be that blacks will continue to be stigmatized, and without policy needed to combat racial exclusion under both neoliberal and pro-social protection governments. But for the perspective of the racial equality promotion, perhaps there is a tendency to recognize and positively valorize governments that implement redistributive policies that favor social well-being. The neoliberal playbook followed by Cardoso government does not seem the same as the of Lula, since it showed itself to be pro-social protection. Why there was an increase in employment under Cardoso administration, which went from 4.8% in 1994 to 8.3% in 2002. Unemployment in the first year of Lula's administration was 12.4%, but had fallen to 6.7% by 10,000. Beyond this, 14 million jobs were created between 2003 and 2010. While Cardoso lowered the minimum age, which fell from $110 to $8 between 1999 and 2002, there was a constant increase in the real minimum wage under Lula government, which stood at $291 in 19. The progressive increase in this real value of minimum wage under Lula government broke with a considerable reduction in social inequality in Brazil. While the Gini coefficient measuring income inequality had shown a decrease from 1994 to 2009, the largest decrease happened precisely during the Lula government. In 2002, the Gini was 0.586, but fell to 0.527 in 2011. According to research Marcelo Neri, the income of poorest Brazilian increasing far faster than the richest. Between 2001 and 2011, the income per capita of the richest 10% increasing 16 cumulatively, while the income of poorest grew by 91%. According to Neri, the income of blacks grew fastest of all groups. The income of those who self-identify as black and mixed increased by 66% and 85% respectively, as opposed to 47% for whites. If no significant difference can be found between Cardoso and Lula governments in terms of failing to take racism into account as a cause of profound inequalities, the improvement just discussed leave little doubt that governments oriented in favor of social protection tend to be less exclusionary than neoliberal ones, and that the former provides a great degree of justice when judged in terms of the promotion of racial equality. Thank you. Sorry for my English.
Thanks to Michaeline, Randy, Terence, Kayla, Bernice, and our video recorders and filmmakers for the invitation and making the organization of this event possible. And I want to start, like the camera probably won't be able to go through all of the slides. I got a little bit carried away with the slides, as you're going to find out very soon, over the past 2 days, including last night when you were all having fun at dinner. I was hard at work preparing the presentation for today, for different reasons. And what I'm going to present, even if I have all these slides, is not about Afro-Colombian groups as a whole, by no means. It's not even about Afro-Colombian movements as a whole. It's more about ontological politics, as the title suggests. And this comes out of work that I've been doing, particularly with Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blasel, including a year-long seminar at UC Davis that is going on now, that brings together conversations on relationality, non-dualist ontologies, post-liberalism, and so forth, in science and technology studies, in STS, and people working with indigenous movements and Afro-descendant movements, including activists themselves from those movements. So this is sort of the context for that, which is a conversation that is going on both in social theory, but also in social life and social movements. So it's not just a conversation going on in the academy, but it's going on much more global than that. The second observation before I start with the slides is that this is, as in the case of Kathy's presentation yesterday, is going to sort of complement very well Kathy's presentation. and refer to some of the same issues from Ecuador, I will be talking about Colombia, is that this is based on almost 20 years of work with a particular group of movement activists called the Proceso de Comunidades Negras, the process of black communities. And although again, I'm not going to foreground the work with the movement per se. And the third caveat was that I was going to say that I won't probably won't be able to go through all the slides. And by what I mean by ontological politics, and I just want to give you an intuitive sense for now, which is ontological politics, that's kind of politics that takes place when conflicts, or on the basis of disagreements of conflicts that are ontological, that are about different visions of the world, different worlds actually, but that are usually not seen as such. This is the case in many environmental conflicts, for instance, and also in the case of many indigenous and black social movements, in which what is at stake in the struggles are really different world visions, and as I say, literally different worlds. And this is sort of the intervention that this group is making about relational politics. And that my general question is, can these ideas about relationality provide some sort of basis for thinking about affirmative action as well? And I should have said also from the beginning that I'm not an expert on affirmative action, I'm actually very ignorant of affirmative action. So I hope this has some resonance among those of you who are more familiar with the concepts. Okay, so this is also an experiment of sorts to see if I can convey through images and charts intuitively this idea about ontological politics. So we start in the Colombian Pacific. We try to sort of fly to one of the rivers of the Pacific. The picture is not very clear, but it doesn't really matter. When I copied it from Frank who sent me this picture onto my PowerPoint, it just didn't copy clearly, unfortunately. But if we sort of fly into this river or arrive into the Pacific, into one of these rivers in the Pacific, it's this amazing rainforest region that is shaped by many, many, many rivers that flow from the Andes mountain chain towards the Pacific littoral. And we try to sort of connect deeply, which is very difficult to do, obviously, in short notice at least, to what is going on in this river. And what is going on here, and we recognize is that this is a very rich and complex relational world, and what we're going to be discussing is relational world. Let me just give you some very few indications of what I mean by that. The first thing is that, let's assume that this is father and daughter, that these are not liberal individuals. I mean, I really like Kamela's concept of liberal region to displacement, because what is going on, what is going to impinge upon this region, as we move along in the presentation, is precisely that, the liberal regime of displacement which is destroying many of these relational worlds, or collective worlds. So these are not individuals, they are persons who exist in deep networks of interrelations with other humans and kinship groups and so forth, but also with the natural world. There is a deep interrelationship that is maintained in these networks among people with different collectivities in the natural world, with the spiritual beings, a connection that establishes that the social world and the natural world are inseparable, as opposed to what we usually do within sort of the modern ontology that we separate nature and culture and so forth. So this is what is going on here. This is an embodied, embedded, place-based ontology, a relational ontology, I want to call it. Just very quickly, a few more slides about this. A river settlement, another one. The shellfish collectors, mostly done by women, it's a very difficult task, but it's a task that women are defending today. Many women in mangrove forests in the Pacific are defending this. It's under attack for many different reasons, including to build huge industrial shrimp cultivation schemes in some parts of the Pacific, displacing the women as well. But again, it's a relation of the world, intimate knowledge of the mangrove, and so forth. And this is the liberal regime of displacement. This is what is the African oil palm. The tremendous expansion is stopped now because of a disease on the palm. Thousands and thousands of hectares, destroying the forests and displacing communities, decided to plant these palm for agrofuel plantations. And this is also part of destroying these relational worlds. Plan Colombia was a US funded at a tune of about $1 billion per year for about 8 years at least now. which started as a sort of supposedly to be as a drug control set of policies with the fumigation of crops we're going to see where and what is the relevance of the Pacific, destroying cocaine laboratories. It resulted in being also an anti-insurgency set of campaigns against the FARC guerrillas. Focused initially on the eastern place of Colombia. So this is again the war on relational walls. This is a local prediction of that from the Putumayo region. Again, trying to give you more an intuitive sense of what is going on in this region without spelling out the complexity of what is happening there. But if we look, and this is very interesting, there's no way data of the Vice Presidency of the Republic by an anthropologist friend of both Kathy and I, Arturo, that started to see, how in the Putumayo region and the Caquetá region, which is the concentration of coca cultivation initially in the 90s, and how with the Plan Colombia programs, it starts to move and speed over into the Pacific from 2001 to 2004. Not only, and there's a series of maps that will show them very clearly, but there's a tremendous correlation in this span of about 4 or 5 years. All of the armed conflict, I mean, not all of it, because it's all over the place now, but a good part of the armed conflict, guerrillas, paramilitaries, the state, people growing coca, cocaine cartels, all of them, start to move into the Southern Pacific, and then start to move all the way up, which is the situation right now. A tremendous situation of massive displacement by all of these armed conflict processes and co-cultivation processes. And so a few things about the region. This is much more descriptive. So it's a very important tropical rainforest. It was discovered to be one of the hotspots of biodiversity worldwide in the late 80s, early 90s. And since then, there was, especially in the 90s, there was a tremendous degree of attention to this region and for the conservation of the biological diversity in this region. It was also discovered that this region is the territory, particularly of Afro-Colombians and indigenous peoples, especially 90% of Afro-Colombians, the population of this region. And it has been linked, obviously, to the global economy through cycles of boom and bust since the 16th, 17th century, but relatively isolated from the rest of the country until the 1960s and 1970s, when development started to happen and when African oil palm mining, extraction of timber started on a massive scale. And so development plans start in the 80s. It's a capitalist expansion, as I was saying. Low 70, something happened very important that happened in 1991 that Kathy referred to this as well yesterday, was the reform of Colombia's national constitution in 1991 that reversed the nation-building project from the project of building a single mestizo racial democracy kind of society to building a pluriethnic multicultural society. In that context, then, there was this amazing surge of activism, also on the part of both Black and indigenous communities in the Pacific and from many other parts of Colombia. We're talking about the Pacific, but this goes on in other parts of Colombia as well. That resulted in the collective and territorial rights for Black and indigenous communities in this region. And so then I hope that introduction was a bit sort of clear to convey the sense again of what is at stake here. And my provisional argument for now is the following: that affirmative action policy takes place within a globalizing world that is driven by a particular ontological politics. We can call it liberal politics, modern politics, modernity, liberalism, capitalism, it's all combined. And this ontological politics is based on a Euro-American mythology that posits the existence of one world, of a one-world world. I'm sorry that word world is difficult for me to pronounce. Mundo in Spanish. I wish I could say mundo. A world that exists by itself, independent from our actions. It's sort of the world is out there, we're here, humans are within it, but the world is external to us. This view of external reality that we believe in. This is actually from John Law. John Law is also part of this sort of seminar. Has a really fascinating paper that I encourage you all to do, called "What's Wrong with the One World World?" And it's very short, and it's one of the most concise statements about this idea of the modern idea that we all exist in this one single world. As opposed to that, I was saying, people who are emphasizing ontological politics are saying, no, we exist in multiplicity worlds. There are multiple worlds. And there are risks in asserting that. Again, I think Kamala talked about some of those recent movement on uncommon cultures. Okay, and this one world is continuously being enacted to particular practices. The plantation that I showed you before, the African oil palm plantation, is one of those practices that enact a one world, a dualist ontology that separates nature and culture. If you separate nature and culture, if you don't see people are relationally tied to the territory, then you can build a plantation and it's fine. Well, from the perspective of relational ontology, it's not fine. It is what destroys, the collective world. And including practices, obviously, as we all know, we call that coloniality, Latin American jargon, some Latin American jargon, that erases the world as multiple, or pluriverse, as some people are going to call it. So the social movements today are struggles over ontological difference. They contribute to enacting a different world through their political strategies. They emphasize difference and autonomy that reflect worlds in movement. So social movements are not just about inclusion, and that's very different from the situation in the US and other parts of the world. And the specificity of the South American, and to some extent, some Latin American regions, is not even all of Latin America. It's some regions in Latin America, Chiapas and Oaxaca, so the Mexico's no doubt engaged in these ontological politics for autonomy. And the Andes, many parts of the Andes, Southwest Colombia, very clearly so, parts of Ecuador, Bolivia, parts of Argentina, and so forth. Okay, so the different worlds in movement. This is a way to represent the dualist ontology of modernity, very sort of a standard argument. If you want, you can take it back to Latour, but I think ecofeminists were working on this already in the 1970s, before Latour. The separation, our modern culture is based on this divide between nature and culture, us and them, mind and body. What the people working on the decolonial perspective add is that the divide between us and them, the colonial divide, is obviously integral and central and inseparable and necessary for the other two divides between mind and culture, nature and culture and mind and body. The result is these beliefs. I call them beliefs because they are beliefs. We believe in the individual. We believe that we are individuals separate from the flow of life of the universe, if you wish to put it more radically, as Buddhist ministers would put it. But we are, the individual as such doesn't exist from the relational perspective. We are all, deeply relational persons. The ethnography of, for instance, of Melanesia is really eloquent about showing how this liberal individual doesn't exist in many social groups in Melanesia, but it is all very deeply relational persons connected to each other, to the clans, to the ancestors, to the environment, to spiritual beings, etc. So that's the dualist ontology that is enacted, or the result of the enactment of the one world. This is from my friend Mario Blaser. I just like it because we talked yesterday about, I think Denise was talking about, and Kamala has written about this as well, to what extent that this notion of culture, is it really useful? What are the traps in using the notion of culture? So modernity creates this notion of culture separated from nature. And of course, only our culture can really produce truthful knowledge about nature, objective knowledge about nature, which is science. They don't have science. And the other people have culture, a different kind of culture. And this is the step that Mario makes about the taming of radical difference through culture. So again, we moderns have a particular, special kind of culture because it is based on universal reason, on science, which they don't have. So any other ontology, like the relational ontology, is tamed through the concept of culture. And that's why, to some extent, some people are using ontology, and this is a wider shift within social theory and social movements. I don't know yet if it is much better than culture. That's a good point. It would be a good point of debate. It reintroduces many of the problems, but it also, introduces new problems, I think, but I think it solves some of the problems of culture. And so if we go back to the Colombian Pacific, we talked about the writing of the Constitution. Some of the debates that have been happening in Colombia, and Kathy actually knows more about this than I do, for the context of affirmative action in particular, are, to what extent are these, and Saleh's a presentation on Brazil and different West Cameras in India are dealing with some of these questions as well. For instance, the question about this, the multiculturalism, pluriethnicity, and so forth, is this functional to the state, to the neoliberal state? And many people in Colombia would argue, yes, it is. And so in that case, we should just forget about these policies, they are not good, etc., etc. I think in Colombia, there are some academics also that made, as one of the Brazilian colleagues made a comment yesterday, colleagues that have made a living out of writing about blacks and indigenous peoples, and now that affirmative action policies come into the picture, they say, no, 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 there's nothing like that, and we don't like this. So all of that debate is happening in Colombia as well, but especially the movement. And in the, I think I have about 7 minutes left already only. I'll talk about this particular movement, and this particular movement about an instance or a strategy of ontological politics. So it is a movement called Proceso de Comunidades Negras, Process of Black Communities. It's a network of black movement organizations. It's very visible. It's not the only part, the only movement in Colombia of Afro-Colombians by no means, but it's one that has played a very central role and visibility over the past 20 years, and characterized by these amazingly bright and committed activists of this 20-year period. There's a new generation of activists now, mostly young Afro-Colombians, mostly young women as well. And from the very beginning, I think this was one of the aciertos, one of the great, how do you call aciertos? No, it's not aciertos, like right decisions, correct decisions, again, politically correct decisions. And the political analysis of this movement is at the forefront also. One of the these politically correct decisions, as I think, I prefer to think about it, is emphasizing from the very beginning that these movements were about the defense of cultural difference and about the defense of territorial rights that enable that cultural difference. The second one, to identify these 5 political organizing principles. This is from one of the activists with whom I've been working for this over the past 20 years. These slides. The right to an identity is the first one. So the right to being black from the perspective of all cultural logic and cosmovision, and one that counters the logic of domination. The second is the right to a territory, space for the exercise of identity, the territory and space for the recreation of the cultural vision. So the terms are interesting here. The third right is the right to autonomy, the right to the exercise of being who we are. We are autonomous internally and in the political domain and aspire to social and economic autonomy. The fourth one is the right to a construction of an autonomous vision of the future, including a vision of that thing called development. So these 4 rights to me ground what I would call today, we didn't call it then, but I think this is not just an intellectual construction or something of a figment of the intellectual imagination. I think this is something that we can plausibly read from the practices and discourse and concepts of this particular social movement, that this might ground in ontological politics. I will skip through this to explain sort of how this movement sees itself, the political strategy, so the ontological politics that it has been able to advance. This comes from the late 90s as a result of many workshops and deliberations in which you go back to the river and we think about what's going on with these rivers in the Pacific and the defense of local communities in the rivers. You say the communities emphasize we have a life project. We don't want a development project. Our project is un proyecto de vida. So we have a life project which is centered on the vivir bien. So from the late 90s, this group already, communities had a notion of vivir bien, very similar to buen vivir, now in that also Kerry talked about yesterday. So, and the social movement articulates through this concept of the Pacific as a region of territory affected groups. So they say the Pacific is not this thing that environmentalists and ecologists tell us, or the government development plans tell us it is. Reservoir resources, biodiversity, yeah, it is that. But more than that, is the space where ethnic groups have been able to create a world, if you wish, to craft a way of life, a way of being, doing, and knowing. So that concept of region territory articulates the life project of the community with the political project of the social movement. And the articulating variable is autonomy. So autonomía is having tremendous history in Latin America, tremendous trajectory in Latin America, since the Zapatista, of course, we started talking about autonomia, but even from before, many movements in South America have been talking about autonomia in one way or another, very much independent from, the discourse about autonomia especially from Italy, and different from it. Okay. Looking about, I have over 5 minutes. Okay. I'll give you an idea what else is here in the PowerPoint. It's not yet a paper, so I apologize for not having a paper. In past after 1998, 2000, the spillover 2000, 2004 of the armed conflict and co-cultivation and massive displacement started to happen. The movement changed its strategy already. We sort of developed different ways to emphasize this ontological politics. It started to talk about racism, which it never did. I mean, it talked about cultural difference, but it didn't emphasize it strategically. At least this sector of the movement didn't emphasize racism throughout the 90s. It started to do it in the context of the post-Durban debates as well. They participated in Durban, obviously. And so it started to emphasize what is called DESC in Spanish, Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales, and economic, social, and cultural rights. The struggles against racism, the census, taking a very important role in the census, in the debate over the categories of self-definition for the census, and making statistical invisibility of black peoples visible, and trying to introduce a different way of valorizing and making visible the presence of Afro-Colombians, and a number of other interventions in the legal domain, and also concerning the specificity of the ethnic group and the specificity of women within the Afro-Colombian groups. Okay, I'm going to skip to this, but I was going to link it to the ontological politics that is going in Ecuador, and the rising lexicon of talking about buen vivir as an alternative to development, and talking about the communal form of politics. And the communal form of politics, let me just show you that one, which is a number of movements, intellectuals, indigenous intellectuals, some black intellectuals, some obviously academics as well, are sort of focusing on this re-emergence of communal logics. And of course, especially, we as critical theories, we get community, tradition, civilization, and all our antennas go up because of the connotations of homogenizing, romanticizing, forms of oppression within that. All of that is clear. What I can tell you is that there is a new way of theorizing the communal, which is anti-essentialist, which doesn't homogenize, doesn't overlook internal heterogeneity, and sees communities as an always open-ended project, but one that has to be changed from within as well, one that has to contribute, obviously, not only to the defense of tradition, but to the transformation of tradition, especially the de-patriarchalization of society, as in a fascinating conception of communitarian feminism coming out of indigenous women in Bolivia, and so forth. So that's something that is coming up. I just was jotting down yesterday, as different people were talking, a lexicon for ontological politics, ancestrality, memory, cosmovisión, collective identities, life projects, crisis de modelo civilizatorio, civilizing model, buen vivir, autonomía, etc., etc., etc. So again, sort of there's a sense in which this ontological politics is there in some fashion. And some of and I think I will end with this, some key issues in ontological politics. The key question that people in STS and in the indigenous cosmopolitics, social movement, indigenous movements are posing is, what kinds of worlds are enacted through what sorts of practices? How does dualism, ontological dualism, enact particular worlds, like the plantation kind of worlds? Okay? Like the gold mining, collective, transnational gold mining kind of worlds, and make it not only possible but credible, as opposed to what kinds of worlds can be enacted through non-dualist relational practices. Okay, and maybe the final one, that if there are multiple worlds, there are multiple kinds of politics. And this is the work that Marisol de la Cadena in particular has been doing. I mean, in many anti-mining And in cases of environmental protests in South America now, for instance, a lake or a river or a mountain is mobilized against the activities of the companies of the state as a sentient being. And she says, if we take that at face value as we should, our notion of politics also have to change. How do we involve that sort of the appeal to the spiritual, to the sacred, to the non-human, and not change our notion of politics? And I think that's what she says. We have to displace the modern understanding of both science and politics if we want to take seriously this ontological politics. And this was just playing around with just last night. We move from the one world ontology through pluriverse. Cosmogony is a thing. Kathy talked about that. The colonization of normative life of the universe that Louis talked about as well. And these transition discourses, I've been paying attention to that and trying to write something about transition discourses and narratives that are emerging over the past, especially over the past 5 years, but obviously from before, in the face of the combined crisis of ecological, food, climate, poverty crisis. This amazing collection of transition discourses, like degrowth, civilization and model, change civilization and model, both in the global north and in the global south. And there is very little conversation between the discussions on transitions in the north and the south, which just begin to happen. And that's part also of this transition activism, that it is part of the ontological politics. Okay. And I'll leave you with this. This particular movement always ends most of its declarations and communiques and support with this declaration of the Pacific as a territory of life, happiness, and freedom and autonomy. And you can ask the question, well, how can, faced with so much destruction, how can they still emphasize that? But that's the politics of life, the life politics that Kathy was talking about as well. Thank you.